The lighthouse keeper, a body buried under the lighthouse foundation for 40 years. A silver lighter that doesn't belong. A son who never knew his mother, about to learn that his entire town was built on her disappearance. 12 hours until they demolish it all. 13 hours earlier, the grease-stained crowbar bit into the rotted floorboard with a sound like bone cracking. Ethan's right hand, slicked with sweat and salt, gripped the iron handle with the kind of force that comes from routine, the same force he'd used for 7 years to maintain this lighthouse, to replace wooden slats and patch the endless corrosion that the Atlantic wages against everything made of metal and hope. The floorboard groaned. Splinters erupted upward like accusations. It was 4 a.m. The maintenance work shouldn't have waited, and Ethan never waited. The auxiliary generator hummed its steady, rhythmic thrum, that sound that had become the pulse of his solitude. Above him, the lighthouse lantern rotated with mechanical precision, throwing yellow-tinged light through the flickering work lamp. Outside, the heavy rain drummed against the stone walls in patterns that almost sounded like Morse code. The floorboard snapped upward. His fingers reached into the dark, silt-filled hollow beneath, brushing against something cold and wrapped. Leather. Old leather. He pulled, and the wood groaned like it was giving up a secret it had held since the ocean itself was young. Chunks of dry rot scattered. Cobwebs tore. The darkness exhaled a smell like tombs and rust. A journal, waterlogged, wrapped in rotted oilcloth that disintegrated at his touch. Ethan shook it, and the corroded leather shed bits of its skin. He wiped the cover with an oil-stained rag, and faint gold embossing appeared through the grime. Letters that seemed to rise from the decay, like bones surfacing from sand. Diary of Thomas Thorne, 1984. His grandfather's handwriting, his grandfather's name. But there was no diary here. His grandfather had left him nothing but this job, this lighthouse, this sealed space, where nothing changed and no one came. The first page opened with a sound like dry leaves breaking, water-damaged blue ink, frantic and uneven. They think the sea hides everything. They are wrong. It's under the feet of the watcher. A coded grid fell from the back pages as he turned them. Ethan caught it before it hit the damp floor, his heart already accelerating into a rhythm that felt wrong for 4 a.m. A visionaire cipher, columns of letters, and scribbled in the margins, GPS coordinates, local coordinates, coordinates that placed something precisely beneath the lighthouse grounds. The rain outside began to sound like applause. By 7:30 a.m., the fog had rolled in so thick that the road to the lighthouse had become a gray abstraction. Ethan stood on the catwalk, looking down at the gravel path below. The journal pressed against the small of his back beneath his heavy wool sweater. The weight of it felt like something alive, something that needed to stay hidden. A black Ford Explorer skidded on the gravel, stopping inches from the lighthouse gate. The sound of the door slam echoed against the cliffs. Sheriff Miller. The badge on his chest caught the gray light like a fish scale. Ethan watched him get out, watched the way Miller moved. Not casual, not the way a sheriff arrived to handle routine paperwork. His jaw was clenched. His shoulders were rigid with a kind of anticipatory violence. The spiral stairs rang beneath Ethan's feet as he descended, metal clanging against metal. The stairs spiraled down the wall, and with each step, the shadows spiraled down beside him. When he reached the door, he opened it only a few inches, letting the fog seep in like something with weight. "Ethan!" Miller's voice was loud, forced. He held up a manila envelope. "Power company sent a notice for the substation repair. Sign this." From above, the lighthouse beam rotated. Even at this hour, in this fog, it continued its mindless work, turning, burning, warning the invisible sea. Miller shoved the clipboard through the gap. That's when Ethan noticed Miller's hand was shaking, not slightly. The tremor ran through his thumb like an electric current. The clipboard had a logo, Blackwood Developments. "Sign it," Miller said again, and this time his voice had dropped. It was almost a plea. Ethan didn't sign. He handed it back, and as he did, he saw something in the window behind Miller's reflection. Behind him, on the road, a crane was being towed on a flatbed truck. Yellow hazard lights, slowly moving toward the Lighthouse road. The door closed. Ethan locked it. He waited until he heard the Explorer's engine receding into the fog. Then he reached beneath his sweater and pulled out the journal. The year 1984 seemed to pulse on the cover. The countdown, he understood then, had already begun. 11 o'clock. The town storage pier was stacked with lobster crates, their wooden slats bleached by salt and weather. Ethan needed supplies, food, water, anything that might sustain him through the next hours. And the pier was the fastest way to reach the market. It was also, he would discover, the most predictable route. The boot came from the side, catching his legs and sweeping them out from under him. Ethan hit the wet wood hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. His shoulder exploded with pain. Lobster crates rattled and shifted, threatening to cascade down onto him. A tall man in a yellow slicker swung a rusted pipe, and the iron whistled through the air where Ethan's head had been a second ago. The pipe connected with the wooden crate instead, and the explosion of splinters hung suspended in the gray air like insects frozen mid-flight. Ethan rolled again. His hand found the gaff hook on the wall, a tool meant for hauling nets, but just as effective for catching a man's wrist. He swung it with everything he had, and the hook bit into the thug's arm. The man screamed. Ethan twisted, and the man stumbled backward, his momentum carrying him into the harbor. The water was freezing. It seemed to swallow the man whole. The second thug ran, but his boot caught on the wet pier. He stumbled, and as he fled, something fell from his pocket. A silver lighter, gleaming and precise in the gray daylight. Ethan picked it up. His hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. The lighter was pristine, unlike the journal, unlike everything else in this town that seemed to be slowly rotting from the inside. An engraving caught his eye. M.B. Forever. M.B., the initials of Miriam Blackwood. The woman who disappeared in 1984 without a trace. The unsolved disappearance that nobody in town wanted to discuss, that had become woven so deeply into the fabric of the place that it had turned into something like the weather, something that simply existed. Ethan flipped the lighter, his breathing still raw from the fight. On the bottom, a small sticker. Vance and Associates. The most powerful law firm in Maine, handling estate law, property disputes, everything that mattered in a town like this. He stood there on the wet pier, water dripping from his clothes, the lighter in one hand, and the understanding beginning to crystallize in his mind, like frost forming on a window. The answers weren't in the journal. They were in the questions it refused to ask. They were in who wanted him dead. The Salty Anchor diner was half full. The kind of place where conversations stopped when you entered and started again after you left. The lunch crowd, mostly town elders, the ones who owned buildings, who sat on boards, who knew where the money actually went, turned to look when Ethan walked in with his wet clothes and his cold eyes. He found a table. He sat. He pulled the silver lighter from his pocket and slid it across the laminate surface with enough force that it skidded past the edge before Mr. Vance caught it. The lawyer was there. Coincidence, maybe. Or something that looked exactly like inevitability. Vance was in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ethan made in a year. He was drinking coffee from a white ceramic mug, and when the lighter skidded to him, the coffee sloshed over the rim. "Miriam Blackwood's lighter," Ethan said. The entire diner had become a single held breath. Vance's face went the color of fresh plaster. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss that only Ethan could hear. "The lease for the Lighthouse grounds was signed by your grandfather, Ethan. It expires at midnight. We've already filed for eminent domain." He tapped his wristwatch, a gold Rolex, the kind of watch that announced itself to the world. The seconds ticked with mechanical precision. "You have 11 hours to disappear," Vance said. "After that, we level the place." The reflected light from the watch danced across Ethan's face like a countdown. Ethan's hand moved. He grabbed Vance's tie and pulled him halfway over the table. The diner went silent. Every patron, the sheriff was there now, Ethan noticed, sitting in a corner booth, watching, turned to look with eyes that were perfectly, completely dead. They looked like a jury. They looked like a conspiracy with a face. Ethan let go. Through the diner window he saw it. A crane being towed on a flatbed truck, its yellow boom cutting a diagonal line against the gray sky. The countdown wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was literal. 4 o'clock. The storm was gathering on the horizon, the clouds turning a shade of green that meant something. Ethan stood behind the oil shed at the back of the Lighthouse grounds, the shovel in his hands feeling like a weapon, which maybe it was. Maybe everything was a weapon now. The coordinates from the journal had led him here, to this precise spot of sandy soil and sea-worn rocks. He swung the shovel down, and the blade connected with metal, a hollow thud that rang through the gathering storm. Something solid, something buried. Ethan dropped to his knees and clawed at the dirt with his bare hands, his fingernails tearing, blood mixing with soil. A rusted steel strongbox emerged from the hole like an artifact from a sunken ship. Ethan smashed the lock with the back of the shovel. The metal gave way with a sound like bones breaking. Inside, gold jewelry, scattered and tarnished, and beneath it, a stack of birth certificates. The top one had names that made the world tilt. Child, Ethan Thorne. Mother, Miriam Blackwood. Date, August 1984. A flash of lightning. The sky opened like a wound. Something hit him from the side. A man in a tactical vest, moving with the kind of efficiency that spoke of training. They rolled in the mud, and the strongbox tumbled away, its contents spilling onto the wet earth. The man tried to shove Ethan's head into the mud. Ethan's fingers found a jagged rock. He didn't think about it. He didn't hesitate. He drove the rock into the man's temple. The man went limp. He slid into the open pit like something returning to the earth. Ethan rolled out, gasping, clutching the strongbox. He looked down at the fallen body and recognized the badge on the tactical vest. Deputy Sheriff. The entire law enforcement apparatus was in on it. Every layer, every protection, every one. Ethan picked up the strongbox and ran for the lighthouse, the rain now falling so hard that it felt personal, like the sky itself was trying to erase him. 6 o'clock. The rain hammered against the windows of the lighthouse living quarters, and Ethan sat at a wooden table with the journal open before him, the cipher sheet beside it, his hands trembling as he scribbled decoded words onto a notepad. Every 5 seconds, the lantern above sent light sweeping through the room. A pulse, a heartbeat, a witness to everything he was learning. Decoded words. Trust fund. Lakeport drainage. Murder. His finger traced the list of names at the back of the journal. Names written in a column like a payroll ledger. Miller, sheriff. Vance, lawyer. Blackwood, the father. Next to them, in his grandfather's handwriting, Dividends of silence. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the town. Between the journal's pages, Ethan found a Polaroid. Miriam Blackwood, pregnant, standing in front of this very lighthouse, smiling. She was wearing the silver lighter on a necklace, right there against her chest. The date on the photo: August 1984. Ethan looked at the birth certificate in his hands. Same date. The lighthouse beam rotated, and in that moment of illumination, Ethan saw something he hadn't understood before. The woman's eyes in the Polaroid, they were his eyes. The shape of them, the color, the way they looked at the world like they were asking a question that would never be answered. He wasn't just a keeper. He wasn't some local boy who'd taken a job at a lighthouse because he had nowhere else to go. He was the heir they tried to bury. He was the living proof that they'd murdered someone and gotten away with it for 40 years. He was their loose end, finally coming undone. 9 o'clock. The storm had reached its peak, and Ethan watched from the slit window as the cars lined up at the gate, their headlights blinding white beams that cut through the rain like searchlights in a war. Men in raincoats were unloading crowbars, gasoline canisters, tools for burning. The lighthouse was about to be erased from the earth. Ethan ran, his movements frantic and rhythmic at once. He slammed a heavy iron bolt across the main door. He began stacking sandbags and old crates against it, his hands moving with a kind of animal desperation. Sweat and rain dripped off his chin onto the wooden crates. Outside, the sheriff fired a shotgun into the air. The muzzle flash illuminated the terrifying number of men surrounding the tower. Easily 30, maybe 40, all moving forward in unison like a tide that couldn't be stopped. They started smashing the lower windows. Ethan ran for the service ladder as a gasoline-soaked rag came flying through a broken window. Flames erupted instantly, spreading across the floor with a sound like a living thing awakening. The roar was enormous. The crackle was like the end of the world, in miniature. Black smoke began to coil up the stairs. The exterior catwalk at 100 feet was slick with rain, and the wind nearly knocked Ethan off his feet as he burst through the door. A hand grabbed his ankle from inside the doorway. He was pulled down onto the wet metal grating, his ribs taking the impact with a sound that was all pain and no sound. The strobing effect of the main lighthouse beam overhead made everything look like a nightmare filmed in fragments. Vance emerged from the doorway, now in a tactical rain slicker, holding a flare gun like it was a toy. He fired it point blank at Ethan. The flare streaked past, missing by inches, and vanished into the sea like a red meteor burning up on re-entry. Ethan tackled him. They slammed against the railing, which groaned and bended outward under their combined weight. They were suspended over the abyss, hung like puppets above the rocks and water far below. Ethan was punching, ribs, chest, anywhere his fists could connect. Vance was choking, bleeding, his hands scratching and clawing. Red light reflected off the wet metal surfaces, painting everything the color of blood. 11:15. The lantern room at the top of the lighthouse was where it all came to an end, at least the end of one part. Ethan was slumped against the Fresnel lens, that massive, perfect optic that had been rotating for 100 years, throwing light out to sea to guide ships safely past the rocks. Blood dripped from his nose onto his shirt. His eyes were beginning to swell shut. Sheriff Miller stood over him, holding the metal strongbox. Vance stood nearby, panting, his tailored suit torn and stained. Miller opened the box and pulled out the birth certificate. He struck a match. "Your mother was a mistake, Ethan. You're just a loose end." The birth certificate caught fire. The paper blackened and curled, the names disappearing into ash. The orange glow of the flames competed with the lighthouse beam, that unstoppable, perfect light that didn't care about human cruelty. The lighthouse kept rotating. The light kept burning. Vance pulled a satellite phone from his pocket. The demolition begins in 45 minutes. No one will ever find where the floor was. No one will ever know that anyone was here. The crane's engine rumbled somewhere far below, a sound like the earth digesting stone. Ethan looked at his phone, which was cracked on the floor. A single bar of signal. And then he saw it. The newly installed emergency weather transmitter was still active, still blinking, still connected to every broadcast frequency in Maine, ready to warn of storms and flooding and danger at sea. The light from the lighthouse beam passed over him again. And in that moment of perfect illumination, Ethan understood what he had to do. He kicked the sheriff's knee with all his might. The bone popped, a sound like something breaking that should never break. Miller collapsed, and Ethan grabbed the maintenance override key from his belt and dived through the hatch, slamming it shut. The lock engaged with a clack that echoed through the tower. Miller's muffled screaming came from above, but it was distant now. Muted, the kind of sound that the storm could easily swallow. Ethan was at the control console, his fingers dancing over the buttons with the muscle memory of 7 years maintaining this place. He knew every switch, every relay, every failsafe. He plugged his cracked phone into the emergency transmitter cable. He hit the button labeled Manual Override, all frequencies. Electronic hum rose in pitch. A waveform appeared on the small monitor. He held the journal up to the transmitter's camera. The red recording light came on. "My name is Ethan," he said, and his voice was calm, terrifyingly calm, the calm of someone who had finally stopped fighting against the current and decided to swim deeper into the darkness instead. "In 20 minutes, this town's leaders are going to kill me to hide the body of my mother, Miriam Blackwood, who disappeared in 1984. His reflection was in the camera lens, and his eyes in that reflection looked like the eyes in the Polaroid. At the Salty Anchor Diner, every television simultaneously switched to his bloodied face. Every smartphone screen flickered with the same image. The patrons stopped eating. They stared at the screens like they were staring at their own executioners. Ethan scrolled through the digital scans of the birth certificates. "The Blackwood Trust didn't just pay for the pier," he said. "It paid for your silence. My mother Miriam is buried under this building. The foundation, the crime scene of 1984. The signatures of the town leaders were clearly visible on the screens. All of them, dating back decades, all of them confirming the payment, all of them complicit. Above the lighthouse, a state police helicopter searchlight swept across the grounds. The crane stopped moving. The men below began to scatter like insects when a light is suddenly switched on, like creatures that had only ever existed in darkness. The helicopter's rotors deafened the night. 6 o'clock in the morning. The sky was clearing. The ocean had stopped its rage. Ethan walked out of the main door wrapped in a shock blanket, and state troopers were leading Miller and Vance away in handcuffs. The sunrise was a deep, bleeding orange, the kind of color that only happens after storms. The crane was being towed away, finally. The demolition equipment was being loaded back onto the flatbed trucks. The town, for the first time in 40 years, was being forced to acknowledge what it had done. Ethan opened the silver lighter one last time. There was a hidden compartment in the lid. He pulled out a tiny, folded note. His mother's handwriting, he knew it immediately, the same hand that had written the words on the Polaroid frame. "To my son, you are the only thing they can't take. The lighthouse is yours, not by lease, but by blood. Check the foundation stone." The sun hit the paper, making it glow. Ethan looked at the foundation stone of the lighthouse. Etched into the granite, hidden by decades of salt and moss and weather, were words that had been theirs all along. Ethan Thorne, heir. His name was carved into the building as if it had always been part of its structure. As if the lighthouse had been waiting for him all this time. Waiting for the rightful keeper to discover what he already was. Ethan leaned back against the tower and looked out at the vast, uncaring Atlantic. The sun was rising over the water, turning the waves gold. He flicked the lighter one more time. The flame appeared, small, perfect, eternal. Then he snapped it shut. The clack echoed across the empty grounds, the only sound that mattered anymore. The lighthouse kept rotating. The light kept burning. And Ethan stood at the base of it all, watching the day break open like an answer finally given to a question that had taken 40 years to ask.